I am delighted to be back with you, and I am delighted to be in Dallas. It occurred to me that yesterday I was in exactly the same position Richard Nixon was in 51 years ago, on my way to Dallas. First of all, it's an honor to be here with so many other researchers and authors and experts that I have enormous respect for. Gary Shaw, Phil Nelson, Beverly. These people really have to be respected for having the courage to come forward and publish and speak and communicate in a system in which the mainstream media has for 51 years sought to suppress the truth. And despite their very best efforts to do so, if you look at polling today, you will find that a majority of Americans understand that there was a conspiracy in Dallas and that Lee Harvey Oswald did not act alone to kill President John F. Kennedy. I really attribute this, frankly, to the internet. You see, in 1963, it was much easier to have a government cover-up. There were only 3 networks, CBS, ABC, NBC. If it didn't happen there, it didn't happen. And frankly, it is only due to the fact that the advent of cable television and the internet and the free exchange of information and research that allows us to break this conspiracy open and start to show more and more people the truth. Also, the good news is that young people don't have the kind of confidence in both the mass media and the government that they used to have in the 60s. After the Vietnam War, after Watergate, after Obamacare, after Ebola, you name it, there's a healthy skepticism in our population, particularly among young people, and they're open to new information. They're open to new ideas. I mean, I'll be candid. I spent 40 years in the corroded rectum of the two-party system. I worked and had regular access to 3 American presidents. I have paid some price for coming forward as I did last year, writing a book which makes the case that Lyndon Baines Johnson was the linchpin of a plot to murder John Kennedy. Thank you. I think it's very important to recognize right up front that one does not have to disbelieve the CIA's involvement in Kennedy's murder. One does not have to disbelieve organized crime's role in John Kennedy's murder. One does not have to disbelieve the role of Big Texas Oil. Indeed, the many researchers who have gone before me, who have fleshed out those areas, are exactly correct. Johnson is the linchpin of a plot that involves all of those entities, although I would argue that his motive is the most immediate one. You see, Lyndon Johnson on November 22nd, 1963 is a man staring into the abyss. Robert Kennedy's not just going to end his political career, he's going to send him to the federal penitentiary. The Bobby Baker scandal, the Billy Salazar scandal were swirling in the national media. In fact, my mentor, Mr. Nixon, whom I am as praiseworthy as is critical, comes to Dallas and holds a press conference at his hotel predicting that John Kennedy is going to dump LBJ from the 1964 ticket. We know that Evelyn Lincoln, President Kennedy's secretary, says in her memoir that on the eve of his leaving for Dallas, he told her, "Don't worry about Johnson, he's not going to be on the ticket." I don't know who it will be, but it won't be Lyndon. He implies it may be Terry Sanford, the governor of North Carolina. But more recent research tells us that Johnson was well aware of the fact that Time Life had 9 full-time investigative reporters on the ground in Texas digging into Johnson's finances for a December 1st Life magazine cover story on Lyndon Johnson's corruption. We also know now, which is in the updated version of my book, that Drew Pearson, the most powerful syndicated columnist of his day, had already written a column for publication on November 24th, 1963, implicating Johnson for taking a $100,000 bribe for the delivery of the TFX contract to General Dynamics. Folks, that's the beginning of the end. Johnson's motives are clear. Now, to believe that Lyndon Johnson could have orchestrated the murder of John Kennedy, one must look at the personality and character of Lyndon Johnson. He is not the civil rights advocate that the Johnson Library wants to tell you about. He is a mentally unbalanced, crude, corrupt, sadistic psychopath. This is a man who I believe is directly responsible for the murder of at least 17 men, murders to cover up corruption, murders to cover up electoral fraud and voter theft. My colleague Phil Nelson is with you today, and I really recommend that you get his new book, because his first book, LBJ, the mastermind of the JFK assassination, is really what put my book into play. It was after reading Phil's book that I realized that I needed to fill in the blanks that I knew about. And now, frankly, Phil's taken it to a whole new level in his new book. Epic stories of corruption and sadism and evil. The attack on the USS Liberty, the theft of $1 billion in federal gold, federally controlled gold. The Johnson story is one that has been whitewashed for history. They recently had a civil rights conference at the LBJ Library. Let's be very clear. Lyndon Johnson was a dedicated, lifelong segregationist. He blocked every major piece of civil rights, voting rights, housing legislation through the 50s in his tenure in the Senate. The 1957 Act, liberals keep saying, what about the 1957 Civil Rights Act? Yes, he added a poison pill amendment that made that bill moot, that said that if you were charged under that act, you would be tried before a state, not federal jury. Folks, that's an all-white jury. No all-white jury in Mississippi will convict anyone of violating the rights of a black man. By the way, John Kennedy voted for that amendment. Barry Goldwater voted against that amendment. Who's the racist? Who's the racist? So it is incumbent on us to look at the character of Johnson. This is someone who was mentally unbalanced. This is someone who, as a boy, tried to stick a dynamite to a dog in the town square and blew it up for his own amusement. Someone who beat a mule to death with an axe handle for his own amusement. Someone who fathered at least 3 illegitimate children that we know of. One of them deceased, 2 of them still with us. Their names are in my book. I'm waiting for the lawsuit. And I think I'm going to keep waiting, because nobody will bring that lawsuit. If they want to bring it, that's fine with me. We can go right to the DNA test. Let's get Lucy and Lindy Bird, and let's get those who I say are Johnson's illegitimate offspring and test them. That lawsuit will never happen, folks. So one has to understand in the incarnate evil of Lyndon Johnson. I have tried to base my book on motive, means, and opportunity. What criminal investigations are supposed to be based on. Johnson's motives are clear. Now let's look at the motives of others involved in the plot. The Central Intelligence Agency motive is very clear. First, there is the Bay of Pigs. They blame John Kennedy for the fiasco on the shores of Cuba. But far more importantly is the Cuban Missile Crisis. You see, the mainstream media myth, brave, charming, dashing John Kennedy faced down the Russians and they blinked, that's not how it went down. We removed our missiles from Turkey and Italy, and that fact was kept a secret from the American people for 40 years. The Central Intelligence Agency knew in real time. The Joint Chiefs knew in real time. Army intelligence knew in real time, but the American people were kept in the dark. One can understand the motivation, the motives of the Central Intelligence Agency. Further is the fact, established I think in a very fine book by my publisher, Phil's publisher, Dr. Feelgood, that President Kennedy had fallen under the spell of Dr. Max Jacobson. President Kennedy is being regularly administered methamphetamine, a proprietary blend. And therefore, you can see how the military types rationalize murder by saying, my God, the man's a drug addict. And the same doctor who's attending JFK, who are his other patients? Joe DiMaggio, Marilyn Monroe, Mickey Mantle, Nelson Rockefeller, Spiro Agnew, Andy Warhol, Halston, Roy Cohn, the list goes on and on. He was the doctor for the beautiful people. I don't know that Kennedy understood he was being injected with meth. All I knew is that he had a very bad back and was in chronic pain. The doctor told him he was getting supplements and hormones that would help him. But we know that he had 3 injections during the summit with Khrushchev. We know, in fact, that he had an injection directly in his voice box on the eve of the famous Nixon-Kennedy debate. So one can see how the military rationalized their action. Organized crime? Organized crime gave John Kennedy $1 million to become President of the United States. And they stole votes for him in the West Virginia primary and in the streets of Chicago and right here in Texas. And in return, Joe Kennedy assured them, Ambassador Joe Kennedy assured them, the Kennedy administration would lay off Carlos Marcello and Santo Trafficante, both of whom were already in the process of deportation hearings under the Eisenhower administration. Well, most of you know the story. Ambassador Kennedy is incapacitated with a stroke. Bobby goes after Trafficante and Carlos Marcello with an axe. He actually succeeds in, at least temporarily, deporting Marcello, dropping him in his shin-tung silk suit and his Gucci loafers in Guatemala without a dime, after kidnapping him at an immigration office. So the motivation, I think, of organized crime is clear. You see, the nice thing about my assertion is one does not have to disbelieve the research of so many other great authors and researchers. JFK, the unspeakable, that's all correct, but it's written from the point of view of just the Central Intelligence Agency. And there are others who say, well, who have written from the point of view of the mob. Yes, they're all present at the table, but Lyndon Johnson is the Grand Marshal of this particular parade. Why? Well, because murder in Texas in 1963 is a state crime to be investigated by the Dallas Police Department and the Dallas District Attorney. You can see the photos. In the 72 hours after the murder, Police Chief Jerry Curry never leaves Lyndon Johnson's side. The district attorney is a political ally of Lyndon Johnson. He comes out and has a press conference and says, we know there was a conspiracy, we will track them down. Then he gets a call from the White House. Then he has a second press conference. There was no conspiracy. We think it was one guy. On a dime. We know that Richard Nixon in town that day. He flies back to New York on the morning of the 22nd. He learns in transit that the president has been shot. He learns when he gets to his apartment house that John Kennedy is dead. He goes to the phone. He calls J. Edgar Hoover, who he knows, of course, has 8 years as vice president. And he says, Edgar, was it one of those right-wing nuts? And Hoover says, 7 minutes after Kennedy's death, Hoover says, no, Dick, it was a communist. Wow, how did we know that so quickly? So, motive means opportunity. Then, eyewitness evidence, fingerprint evidence. At least 6 individuals tell either the FBI or the Dallas Police Department that they see a man who meets the description of Malcolm Wallace in the 6th floor window of the Texas School Book Depository building. 2 of those witnesses describe a man who meets Wallace's description fleeing the building. One man, Richard Carr, has 6 separate attempts on his life after he goes voluntarily to the Dallas police and tells them what he's seen. Now, I am not one who believes there was one shooter. I think there were multiple shooters, just as there were multiple plotters. I think the mob has somebody at the table. I think Nicoletti probably is the shooter from the Knoll. Someone certainly is. I think there may be a shooter in the sewer grate. There may have been a shooter in the Daltex building. I think that there's a lot of people in this turkey shoot, but it is consistent with the personality, the control freak personality of Lyndon Baines Johnson, that he would want his own shooter at this particular arcade. This morning I debated Professor John McAdams on radio for an hour. This guy just makes it up as he's going along. I mean, and I'm happy to announce that early next year I will be debating Gerald Posner in a symposium sponsored by the Palm Beach Post. And I may call on some of you for a little advice before I do that, because this guy looks slippery to me. It is notable that this many of you come out on a day like today. It is notable that this many of you come out, as many are for this conference this weekend, in a search for the truth. I'm not right about everything. I'm just putting together the history with the best possible research I can. And I respect those who have put together the other parts of this puzzle. Those, again, who say the CIA is responsible. They're not wrong. Those who say the mobs, they're not wrong either. But Johnson has a unique relationship with each. Who is it who controls the aerospace subcommittee where the CIA budgets are secretly approved? Why, that would be Lyndon Johnson. Who is it taking bribes from Carlos Marcello, passed through Jack Halfin, to protect illegal gambling here in Texas? Why, that would be Lyndon Johnson. And who's the biggest water carrier for the oil depletion allowance, the sweetheart tax treatment that saves the right-wing Texas oil millionaires millions? Why, that would be Lyndon Johnson. This is why I call him the linchpin of this particular plot. So this morning, I started the debate with McAdams when the host, who was a pretty good fella and I think pretty unbiased, kept referring to conspiracy theorists. They said, well, you use that like a club. You see, that's become a pejorative. Oh, you're a conspiracy theorist. In other words, you must be nuts. So, I didn't fool around. I started calling him a lone nutter. I said, well, lone nutter's like Professor McAdams. He did not like that. In all honesty, they call us crazy, but they're the ones who rely on a magic bullet that changes direction. Who's crazy? So, I am delighted to be with you today. I am delighted to be with Phil Nelson, for whom I have enormous respect, and so many others here, Gary, others who have gone before me and done yeoman work in terms of being truth tellers, in terms of laying out the facts for the American people. The good news is that this research is not over. We will learn more and more as time goes on, as other people come forward. I expanded my book on Lyndon Johnson largely because after I published my first book, I began getting an enormous amount of new information coming in over the transom. Not all of it correct, not all of it accurate, but much of it accurate. And it led me to expand the book in interesting ways. So we know, for example, that when Robert Kennedy was shot, and he lay in a Los Angeles copy, mortally wounded, that Pierre Salinger, his press secretary, and Stephen Smith, his brother-in-law, called Vice President Hubert Humphrey, and they said, there's a brain surgeon in there's a brain surgeon in Boston, and we think he could save Bobby's life. Will you dispatch a military plane? And of course, Humphrey said, I'll do it. Contacted the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and he said, we'll do it. And they dispatched the plane. 20 minutes later, Lyndon Johnson called Humphrey and chewed his ass. You had no authority to send that plane. I have canceled it. We know that Lyndon Johnson calls the hospital in Los Angeles and he asks for the director of the hospital. He doesn't say, how is Senator Kennedy doing? He says, is he dead yet? Is he dead yet? These are the actions of a psychopath. That was our 36th president. Now, many have asked me, have you had any blowback from the Johnson family? No, I don't expect any. I really don't. Why? Because truth is the ultimate defense. So, I thank you. I salute you for being here today and over the weekend. I'm happy to answer any questions you may have. We have copies of my book. I urge you to load up on the books of some of my colleagues here who have done yeoman work themselves in terms of trying to complete the picture for the American people of what really happened. After the House Assassinations Committee, which I think was very carefully steered away from the CIA connections and towards organized crime, given the backgrounds of those conducting the investigation, and after the Church Committee, particularly the subcommittee chaired by my longtime friend, Senator Richard Schweiker, who I worked for briefly in the Senate, even the government rejects the bullet-riddled Warren Commission. In this day and age, to continue to believe the conclusions of the Warren Commission almost boggles the mind. Whether it is the lack of powder burns on Oswald's chest and his arms and his face, or whether it is the fact that his rifle is not sighted, and I'm sure we've got some shooters in the crowd. How do you hit a moving target without a sighted rifle? And then they tell us that from a standing still position, Oswald couldn't hit Edwin Walker through his living room window, but he got off 3 perfect shots on a moving target with an unsighted rifle. Common sense leads you to believe that we've been duped, folks. So, I salute you. I thank you. I thank my friend Chris Gallup and so many friends that I see here again from a year ago, and I'd be happy at this point to take any questions.